The ancient stones of Ruang seemed to carry a lament of their own, as if the entire city had witnessed more than it ever dared confess. Between their shadows, a stifled truth breathed truth about what did they do to Joan of Arc before she was burned at the stake. A chapter as dark as it is silently erased from official records. If you're fascinated by dark stories, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It was 1431. The recent winter had left deep scars, and spring arrived without relief, carrying a damp chill that seeped into the walls of the Bouverol fortress, where Joan was imprisoned. The so-called Maid of Orleans. She who had led armies, who had inspired entire cities, was now just a skeletal figure shrouded in shadows, kept under constant watch, without privacy, without solace, without her own silence. Her cell was small, with walls blackened by dampness. The stench of old straw mingled with the rusty smell of the chains and the heavy air of the English guards who took turns watching her. Joan could no longer clearly distinguish dawn from dusk only, the timid flicker of light that filtered through a crack too high to reach. But what was to come would be even more terrifying. On the morning before her execution, Joan received a visit from Jean Mas, a clergyman assigned to accompany her in her final moments. He brought stale bread and water and, despite his position, his eyes carried something that no other man there possessed: humanity. "Did he sleep?" he asked. Knowing it was a pointless question, Jonah breathed shallowly, as if each movement of her chest required effort. "I hear something else. Instead of sleep," she murmured, "as if the world outside is slipping away from me, step by step." Massue felt a strange weight with those words, a silent recognition that she perceived spiritual nuances that escaped any ordinary observer, and this perception only fueled the court's fear of her. The long and tortuous public trial had been merely the surface, a formal theater where theologians, nobles, and inquisitors vied for control of the narrative. But before the stake, there was still a hidden procedure unrecorded, untaught, but kept alive in the darkest practices of the Inquisition. A ritual of stripping away, a method to break the spirit of someone who, through death, could become more powerful than they ever were in life. The entire atmosphere in the fortress changed as evening fell. Footsteps echoed faster, guards exchanged tense glances, a lamp fell in the corridor, and no one dared retrieve it. Something was about to happen, something most preferred to pretend not to see. Then, 3 hooded men entered the prison complex. They were not soldiers, they were not monks, and they did not carry visible symbols of religious orders. They came to perform a role that no one officially admitted, but that everyone knew existed in the shadows of the canon law of the time. Massue recoiled as he watched them pass, but his heart raced. Eknel rumors, hushed-up stories about spiritual procedures designed not to harm the body, but to disconnect the condemned from any divine hope. Jonah heard their footsteps even before she saw them. She lifted her head and watched the door open as if she already knew that moment would come. "Joan of Arc," said the man who seemed to lead the trio, removing his hood. His face was thin, severe, marked not by pity, but by his role. "There is one last right before your sentence." She didn't answer. She just narrowed her eyes. "My trial is over," he said in a low voice. "There's nothing more they can take from me." The Inquisitor approached like a living shadow. "There still are, maiden. There always are." Jonah felt the tension in the air shift as if the cell itself had become smaller, heavier, colder. The other 2 men entered carrying a dark wooden box. The lid bore circular marks, symbols erased by time or by the many hands that had handled them. When they placed it on the floor, the sound echoed like a hammer on steel. Massue, prevented from entering, remained by the door, peering through the cracks. The Inquisitor opened the box. The air seemed to change. It was impossible to know the exact contents, but Jonah saw enough to understand. Religious objects altered, vestments distorted, symbols that were once sacred, now serving a purpose of denial. "This," said the Inquisitor, touching something inside the box, "is to ensure that your spirit is not taken for pure. We don't want martyrs, Joan. We want silence." She took a deep breath. "They cannot erase what God has written," he replied. The guard stared at the floor. The atmosphere grew so dense that it seemed difficult to breathe. It was as if forces greater than the will of those men were pressing against the narrow walls of the cell. The Inquisitor removed 3 objects from the box, one by one, as if conducting a somber ritual. A torn white cloth, a symbol of denied purity, a broken crucifix, a symbol of shattered faith, and a scroll containing formulas that were rarely read aloud. Formulas intended for the spiritual isolation of the condemned. With each object revealed, Jonah felt an almost physical pressure on her shoulders, as if the ritual were an attempt to break the link she claimed to have with the divine. The men chanted words in Latin, but not in a sacred manner. The rhythm was harsh, oppressive, designed to disorient, to invade the innermost being. Masua watched in disbelief. He had never heard that kind of intonation in liturgies. It wasn't liturgy, it was manipulation. Jonah remained motionless, but her eyes began to well up with tears. Not out of fear, but because I understood what was being done. They didn't just want to kill her. They wanted to prevent her death from inspiring anyone. They wanted to strip her of everything that made her a symbol. One of the men approached with the torn fabric. Another brought the broken crucifix. The Inquisitor held the parchment as if it were the final key to Joan's spiritual disappearance. The young woman took a deep breath. For a moment, a tear fell heavy, silent not from fragility, but from strength being pushed to its limit. Maciel, watching her, felt a deep shiver. There, before him, was a young woman being destroyed, not physically, but spiritually. And yet, something inside her remained intact, something that not even hooded men could reach. When the ritual ended, Jonah was pale and trembling, but not defeated. There was a strange glint in his eyes, like a flame that the wind tries to extinguish, but which remains alive despite everything. The Inquisitor slammed the box shut. "Tomorrow, Jonah," he said, "your story ends." She raised her face. "Wikbat Firam, not mine," she whispered. "The one you fear." The men withdrew. Masu remained motionless, feeling the invisible weight of what he had witnessed. That night, Joan had difficulty finding rest. The air in the cell felt heavier than ever. It was as if darkness itself were alive, and when the first sound of the bells echoed at dawn, she knew the secret ritual was over. The bonfire awaited her, but something inside her, something no Inquisitor could extract, still burned, and it was with this silent flame that she walked, alone, toward what would be her last morning. The darkness before dawn had a texture of its own dense, almost physical, like a cold, damp cloth covering everything. Joan felt this darkness slide over her skin when the guards opened the cell door. It wasn't only the proximity of death that made the air so heavy. It was what would come before it. That which would never be written in official records. That which no chronicler would dare document. The Inquisition's final act to break not the body, but the spirit. Masu walked silently behind the guards. His pale face showed that he knew what was about to happen. Yet he was bound by duty and by torment. The corridor felt narrower than the day before, as if the walls advanced inch by inch upon anyone who passed. The guards did not take her to the courtyard immediately. They turned left, descending a small spiral staircase of ancient stone, so old it seemed to plunge into the very heart of the fortress. The lamp one of them carried flickered in the subterranean breeze, casting shadows that writhed on the walls like restless specters. Joan walked with slow but steady steps. Her hands trembled only from the cold of early morning. Mathieu saw this and wondered how such a frail young woman could carry such silent strength. They reached a heavy door reinforced with iron bars. The guards opened it. A deep sound echoed, like an ancient sigh. Inside, there was another room. Another ritual. Another attempt to extinguish her light before the fire did so before the crowd. The space was lit only by candles arranged in a precise circle. In the center stood a simple wooden bench, without ornamentation, positioned like an inverted throne, meant not for royalty but for annihilation. Beside it, a small table held objects under a dark cloth. 3 men were waiting. One of them, the hooded Inquisitor from the previous night, held a worn, thick-covered book bearing the weight of centuries. The others had indecipherable expressions, not of a trade, but of a ritualistic obedience that surpassed understanding. Joan saw no evil in them. Sophia, an ancient, institutional, almost sacred fear. The Inquisitor motioned for her to come closer. Joan stepped into the center of the candle circle. The growing silence was not natural, it was calculated. Part of the procedure. Masu remained at the entrance, allowed to witness but not to intervene. He felt the air grow heavy in his lungs, as though he were about to enter a chamber to close for the living. The Inquisitor opened the book. "Before the execution," he said, his voice low and drawn out, "there is a rite of verification. Not only must earthly judgment be fulfilled, heaven must be warned as well." It was a distortion of canon law, a dark use of formulas meant to protect souls not. Mark them with silence, but the rite existed. Rare, terrible, kept in the underground of ecclesiastical practice, far from the light. The Inquisitor removed the cloth, covering the objects, and there they were. A broken rosary with missing beads, a chalice without a base, unable to stand, a fragment of black cloth with a word stitched in red, and a small tablet burned with inscriptions not only Latin, but symbols used in primitive rites of spiritual renunciation. Each item had a purpose. Each was a psychological blow. The guards watched, stiff, not understanding the symbolism, but aware they were witnessing something they must never speak of. The Inquisitor approached Joan with the broken rosary. "Joan of Arc," he said, "you are accused of misusing what is sacred, of being guided by voices foreign to the true faith. Before you are cast into the fire, we declare these beliefs broken, like these beads that can no longer be reunited." He held the rosary before her eyes. Joan took a deep breath. A pang of pain crossed her face, not for the object, but for the meaning imposed upon it. Then she replied, "It is not the beads that connect me to God." The Inquisitor swallowed his words for a moment. Then, he continued, he set down the rosary and picked up the chalice without a base. "This chalice represents your broken communion. Before death, we declare that your spirit will no longer be nourished at the divine table." Joan closed her eyes briefly. Masu saw a tear fall slowly down her cheek. It was not weakness. It was the weight of someone who understood the deep layers of spiritual humiliation she was enduring. The Inquisitor placed the chalice on the ground, so it toppled immediately. The sound echoed like a warning, a sign, a sentence. The third object was the black fabric with the words stitched in red: severed, extinguished, unlinked. He lifted the cloth and moved it near Joan's face. "This symbol declares your soul detached from earthly protection. Nothing in your actions will be considered the fruit of divine inspiration." He pressed the fabric against Joan's chest. She took a deep breath, feeling the roughness like an invisible wound. Masu watched, horrified. He knew this ritual was not meant to harm the body. It was worse. It was meant to wound the conscience, identity, hope. And the last item remained. The Inquisitor lifted the fire-marked tablet. The inscriptions were ancient symbols, derived from syncretic practices predating Christianized France. They held no theological function, only psychological. "By this mark," he said, "we declare that you will be remembered not for virtue but for disobedience. Your story will be shaped by the words of men, not by the light you claim to carry." He raised the tablet. He did not touch her to physical, to direct, but he came close enough for the residual heat to reach her skin. Joan did not back away. She did not avert her gaze. She did not shrink. And in that instant, Masu witnessed something he would never forget. Joan was being stripped spiritually, symbolically, psychologically, but not broken. Something within her resisted in silence, like a hidden flame protected by invisible hands. The Inquisitor recoiled, frustrated. He had expected submission, tears, despair. What he received was firmness. "It is finished," he said, snapping the book shut. "The prisoner's spirit is stripped. At dawn, she will be cast into the fire." Joan took a deep breath. "They took nothing," she murmured. "They only took from me what never belonged to me." The guards exchanged glances. Masu swallowed hard. The Inquisitor hesitated, as if her answer had pierced a wall he believed impenetrable. The ritual was over, and as Joan was led out, There was a subtle transformation in her expression, not defeat, but silent revelation. Something within her had endured and survived. Returning to her cell, Joan seemed different. The weight of the ritual still rested on her shoulders, but her eyes held a serenity almost tangible, as if now, finally, she knew exactly who she was and why no one could erase her. And so, in that silent dawn, Joan of Arc's fate was sealed, not by the fire that was to come, but by the ritual they tried to use to disfigure her spiritually. They failed, because something about her, something they didn't understand, remained intact when the first bells tolled that morning. Ruang seemed suspended between two worlds, the world of wakefulness and the world of dreams, the world of the living and the world of the damned. The air carried a cold dampness that clung to clothing, weighing down the steps of all who walked through the narrow streets. But for Joan, that feeling had another meaning. It was the weight of the world trying to contain her. And yet, she pressed on. After the grim ritual of the previous dawn, something within her had profoundly changed. It wasn't strength. It wasn't weakness. It was an almost painful clarity, as if the silent violence they had tried to inflict on her soul had ripped away all illusions, leaving only the essential. Masu walked beside her as the guards escorted her out of the fortress. He noticed that, despite her extreme exhaustion, she seemed strangely light, like someone who had borne all that could be carried. And what would come next would shape not only his death, but his memory. The market square was already packed. Entire familias English soldiers, curious onlookers, religious people, merchants who had interrupted their work to see the young woman who had become a living legend and was now about to be reduced to ashes. The murmur of the crowd sounded like a restless sea, but there was also an underlying tension, a mixture of fear and fascination. Jonah walked slowly, with short steps, and each time she looked up she saw the sky opening up in gray. The sounds mingled, the clinking of armor, the murmur of prayers, the dragging of boots on the stone. She absorbed it all, not out of curiosity, but because she knew these were her last moments among the living. Masu watched with a heavy heart. In the preceding hours, Joan had survived the most severe ritual a prisoner could face, not physical, but spiritual. She had been declared disconnected, fragmented, emptied of divine protection. It was a mock few would understand, but one he had felt with bitter clarity. Yet, something within her remained irreducible. What the Inquisitors had failed to realize was that this ritual, instead of destroying her, had placed her before herself, strengthening the spark that no man could extinguish. When the guards placed her before the scaffold, Joan raised her face to the priests who awaited her with liturgical books. One of them would be responsible for declaring, before the people, that she died as a heretica sentence that sought to also kill the symbol she would become. But Jonah stared at him firmly. "I ask only for a cross," she said, her voice low but confident. There was an awkward silence. The guards exchanged glances. Some of the soldiers looked away, touched by a strange compassion. Masua felt his heart clench. He knew that Joan was not making this request as a last-minute ritual, but as a gesture of identity, of loyalty, of silent affirmation against everything they had tried to take from her. The priest stepped back slightly, hesitant. One of the Englishmen, perhaps moved by the humanity that the Inquisitors lacked, removed 2 pieces of wood from the ground and improvised a small, simple, rustic cross. He handed it over to Jonah. She held the object with her fingertips, as if it were too delicate to touch. And then something happened. Jonah closed her eyes, and Messie realized she was breathing like someone feeling the relief of finally finding again what they had tried to forcibly take from her. The crowd murmured. The atmosphere changed. It was as if that small gesture had broken the spell of the somber ritual of the early morning. As if, in the instant he touched the cross, everything they had tried to suppress had returned with renewed force. For Masu, this was the moment when he understood the invisible consequences of the forbidden ritual. What the authorities had tried to erase, the faith, the symbol, the spiritual bond emerged even stronger in the final moment. Jonah climbed the steps slowly. Her simple dress rippled slightly in the breeze. She didn't seem to fear what was to come. The bonfire was terrifying, but it only represented the surface of her death. The real battle, the spiritual one, she had already fought the night before, and defeated. As she was positioned in the center of the wooden structure, Masu felt an indescribable emotional mixture of pain and admiration. Joan looked at the crowd. There was no hatred, There was no despair. There was only a kind of quiet melancholy, a profound, almost luminous acceptance that contradicted all the ritualistic effort of stripping away. The priests began to recite the sentence. It was a harsh, dry proclamation that sought to fix in the minds of the people the idea that Joan was guilty, that her faith was madness, that her inspiration was false. But each word seemed to clash against her silence and lose its power. When they allowed Jonah to speak, her voice echoed like a stubborn murmur against the storm. "Everything I did," she said, "I did for God." The crowd seemed to shudder. The inquisitors exchanged irritated glances. Their narrative slipped like sand through their fingers. The bonfire would kill the body, but the dawn ritual had failed to kill what was most important. And then came the moment that would seal his transformation. As they prepared the torches, Monsieur noticed something profound happening to Joan. It wasn't visible on her face, but rather in the atmosphere around her. The young woman seemed to become fully aware that death would not be the end. Not for her, not for her memory, not for the impact her story would have on France and the world. It was as if she had passed through an inner portal. She mumbled something. Monsieur heard, "Now, E.C." It was a simple statement, but one full of revelation. Jonah, before she died, fully understood her destiny. Burning a bonfire would be nothing more than a cruel act. But the ritual that had tried to erase her had become her greatest mirror, and, paradoxically, her liberation. The guards lit the base of the gallows. The wind blew, the crowd retreated slightly, and Jonah closed her eyes, not out of fear, but out of surrender. Masuyu turned his face away, unable to watch the outcome, but in his heart, one truth was forever etched. What they did to Joan before the bonfire didn't destroy her. It transformed her. He made her something greater than a warrior, greater than a prisoner, greater than a condemned woman. He made her an indestructible symbol. In the days that followed, the city murmured about the execution, but there was also silence, a strange, unsettling silence, as if everyone knew they had witnessed something the Inquisitors could never control. The official documents have been adjusted. The details have been erased. The forbidden ritual would never be mentioned. The story would conveniently shape the narrative, omitting the early morning hours when they tried to dismantle his soul. But popular memory, that would remind me. Monsieur left Rouen shortly afterwards. He never spoke openly about what he saw, but he carried it with him until his death. And every time she remembered Joan holding the small, makeshift cross, she knew that no court could ever erase who she had been. A body can burn. A voice can be silenced. But a symbol transcends centuries. Jonah crossed over, and even in the darkest hours, something of her continues to burn silent, indomitable, eternal far, beyond the bonfire that tried to extinguish it.